So happy to welcome to the show just an iconic attorney, civil rights attorney who's been in business here in Southern California for many, many years. You've heard his name associated with lots of big cases here in Los Angeles, including Dijon Kazee and, of course, O.J. Simpson. I'm talking about attorney Carl Douglas. Good morning.
Dominique, thank you so much for having me on the front page. I always welcome the chance to talk about issues to your listeners.
I should have mentioned that Attorney Douglas is in private practice now at Douglas Hicks Law in Los Angeles, trial lawyer of the year, et cetera, et cetera. I've heard you talk about the case you came on today to discuss in other media, saying that it was a case that really kind of surprised you, even after all these years of dealing with so many other police abuse kinds of cases. Tell me why.
Dominic, as you know, and as many of your listeners know, I have been in the civil rights game for 42 years, having worked 13 years with my mentor, Johnny L. Cochran, Jr. I had a chance to hear and see all kinds of different cases involving black officers, white officers, young officers, old officers. But never in my 42 years had I ever encountered an occasion where the officer knew his victim prior to the encounter. And secondly, Dom, I always heard what I thought was ridiculous banter between black officers and white officers, where the white officer would always say about the black officer, "You're not white, you're not black, you're blue." And again, I always thought that was balderdash, that no, that couldn't be so. And then I learned about the remarkable story of Jamal Shakir Jr. Not only does this young, now 23-year-old filmmaker have a backstory that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that is indeed remarkable. Not only does this young brother have the discipline and the commitment at 23 years old to be living on his own in downtown Los Angeles, not in anyone else's pocket, but his own. Not only does this 23-year-old brother have a degree from a college that was created for him because of his unique talents, he owns a production company. He owns a film company. This is one of the most intelligent brothers I have ever seen in my life. And then his story that began on May 29, 2020, the first time this young brother ever saw fit to protest in the name of the memory of George Floyd, only because he heard the helicopters over his downtown apartment and he heard the chants of the protesters on the streets below. And then, as he'll tell you, while he was doing nothing but exercising his First Amendment rights to protest the injustice of George Floyd's death, he saw another black officer that he knew. Not only did he know that officer, Dom, but that black officer was born from the same blood. They come from the same lineal tree. And when he identifies himself and engages that black officer in conversation because he knows him, because he is his uncle, that officer disgracefully directs another officer to fire a less than lethal projectile at him. Now, normally, cops would deny something as outrageous as that. But this young millennial was filming as he was engaging with the officer. Eric Anderson is his name. And not only did Eric Anderson direct that Jamal Shakir Jr. be shot once, but after that first projectile damaged ligaments in his hand holding his camera, he directed he be shot again a second time when he bent over to pick up the camera that fell out of his hand. I thought, Dom, I heard it all until I heard the story of Jamal Shakir Jr. and Police Officer 2, Eric Anderson.
All right, and we have Jamal Shakir with us this morning on the phone as well. Good morning, Jamal.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm blessed. Thanks for waking up with us today. I know it's early. This sounds like something that must have been unbelievable, literally unbelievable for you. You said you were taking part in this protest. Explain the story from your perspective. I mean, we just heard your lawyer's version. I'd love to hear it through your eyes.
Okay, yeah, it's pretty much the same and ultimate. However, once I went out there to go to the protest, as you said, I live downtown, so I heard the helicopters as well as the various peoples running around sporadically in different groups. So once I actually got down there and saw that the protesters actually outnumbered the police, and I was doing my documentation, taking different pictures, taking different videos, and then once more police officers actually arrived, that's when it became more passion because, you always know that there's African Americans that are on the police force. You see them every day. However, in a time like this with such a devastating tragedy, it was one of those things where it was a bit shocking. So once I encountered a few of the black police officers, though, that's pretty much where my focus was driven to. It was more so, what is your morality? How could a paycheck be worth your morals and your values if you had those morals and those values, considering that we all witnessed George Floyd's life be taken away by another man kneeling on him. So after a few officers that I saw, I actually did run into my uncle, Eric Anderson. And when I saw him, it kind of heightened my passion for that, heightened even more because I'm standing to oppose my own blood. So once I actually saw him, there wasn't really a dialogue because there was no back and forth between me and him. It was just mainly me talking. The only thing that he told me, he screamed at me and he was like, "Go home," in which he didn't even know that I lived a couple blocks away from where we were. It was just more of like an animalistic exclamation from him. So once he said that kind of built up even more in me where I started asking him, what would your ancestors say? We share the same blood. We share the same. His father is my grandfather. So I asked him, what would your father think right now? What would your mother think right now? And to that extent, he motioned his baton and had his officer shoot me twice.
I mean, were you completely shocked to even see him there? I mean, I get that your uncle works for the LAPD, but there's a lot of officers on the force. What are the odds you're going to come face to face with your own uncle?
Exactly. That part of it was still to this day is like unbelievable. It's one of those things where never in a million years would I think that I would be in this situation. Never in a million years would I think that I would be opposing my own uncle, because the last time that I actually saw him, with me being a TV and film director, I was shooting a pilot for a TV show. And with the filming permit that I needed, I also needed an off-duty Los Angeles Police Department officer. So instead of reaching directly out to the LAPD to give the money to them, I'm like, hey, I have to pay an off-duty LAPD officer anyway, so I might as well, keep the money in the family and allow him to make that additional money instead of just giving it to a random officer. So I had hired him to be the LAPD police officer for my shoot. So to be able to see him in this light standing opposed me when he was just standing beside me during my TV and film shoot, that was one of those things that was just like breathtaking.
So how did it, this is a weird question, I guess, but how did that feel? I always hear this, we read about non-lethal or less than lethal projectiles, but I don't know, they seem pretty rough to me. How did that feel to you? What was your response?
Hey, Dom, now because there's a possibility that members of the Los Angeles Police Department are listening,
yeah,
I want to limit his discussions of the physical aspects that he's going through or the emotional things that he's going through. Okay. And I would rather answer those questions in his place, because I know every opportunity that he has to shine light on his circumstance is going to be used against him later, right, when he is deposed and when he testifies in his trial. The city lawyers are going to misinterpret his efforts to get out his truth and attempt to suggest that he's doing it for the fame, that he's doing it for the publicity, that he's doing it for his 15 minutes in the limelight. And that is so unfair and untrue. So I want to tell you, he has still warts and marks on his body almost a year later from his being shot in his butt. I'll tell you, he still can't hold a pencil as well as he could prior to May 29th of last year. And I'll tell you, he was at the doctor's office less than 10 days ago for another treatment to the damage to the ligaments in his dominant right hand as a result of his being shot by what they call a less than lethal projectile. So you and your listeners can only imagine the pain that he has gone through physically. Think about when he tries to pick up a spoon to eat some breakfast or some cereal in the morning, and he can't grip the spoon with the same skill without having the pain from the nerves in his hand send a signal to his brain, reminding him of that day. Imagine living downtown, my sister, and every time you either hear a helicopter or hear a siren, you are reminded of the horror of that day, how you had to zigzag and run away toward your house, how someone that you knew who had saw your filming on Instagram Live caught up with you at your door of your apartment building and gave you a ride to the hospital. Those feelings are going to be expressed at the appropriate time and will generate tremendous understanding of the pain that he has endured and continues to endure emotionally and physically.
And I guess this is a little bit of a veer off of the direct facts of your case, but we've been hearing a lot about the use of these projectiles. It's limited by a judge, then it's put back, then it's limited by a judge. Do you know where we are with this now? I mean, because on any given day, that is an option that officers have if you're protesting, to shoot you with these various things that are supposedly non-lethal.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, Dom. There has been lawsuits since May of last year about the misuse of these non-lethal projectiles. There are several problems. One, they're only supposed to be used defensively when a protester is creating a serious threat of violence to an officer. And as importantly, last year, the LAPD trained with a smaller sized projectile, 33 millimeters in size. But when they went out to the streets, they were given projectiles that were 37 millimeters and even 40 millimeter size. So they were larger, more powerful than even the officers had been trained to use. So a federal judge, Consuelo Marshall, in response to a lawsuit that has been filed by members of Black Lives Matter and others, allies, issued a ruling just last week that, one, limited the size of the projectiles that could be used, and as important, limited the circumstances when they could be fired for crowd disbursement, and only if the officer was confronted with a serious threat of violence by the protesters. Here, Jamal Shakir Jr. was fired upon because he was calling out his uncle. That reflects a level of cultural brainwashing that this man has sustained for the years that he has been employed by the LAPD. And that brainwashing has overcome his natural sense of family. And that, to me, is the most disturbing narrative. You can tell, girl, in your voice how unique, and you and the front page hear these stories all the time for years. But I could tell in your voice how perplexed you were, because this is something that you don't even think you'd see in a movie somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think if we saw it in a movie, we would question it as being overly convenient. But
how dare you think this stuff up?
Yeah, right, exactly. It seems a little too convenient. And I don't, I'm not sure what the parameters are. We always hear police departments say, well, we can't talk about this case because there's an ongoing investigation, but then they go ahead and they talk about the victim in the case. We see that time and again. And so it's hard to know where the parameters are. But from the perspective of, the front page, this conversation, by the way, it's Radio Free 102.3 KJLH, Compton, Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Inglewood. From our perspective here on the front page, we've had some conversation about this case without you, and people are stunned, because if I'll do this to my nephew, what would I do to a random person?
Yes, that's the tragic question that this case presents. If I do this to my blood, you don't mean nothing to me. I mean, that is why we have to shine the light on the warrior culture. This case reflects how far that culture impacts a man or a woman who wears the badge. And you got to understand, Jamal Shakir wasn't some thug carrying a gun somewhere. He wasn't threatening anybody with any violence. The only thing he was firing off were words. And he is given that privilege in America to fire off words even at the police, even at their face. And he cannot be injured because he's shooting nothing more harmful than words. Well,
so, I mean, one of the things I think this highlights is the criticism that the LAPD has come under from its own experts regarding its handling of protests. I feel like, Jamal's case is So he's sort of become a symbol of what happens to folks when you walk out in these protests. And I've seen it. Of course, I've been at many protests myself. I'll be at one today, by the way, family at Pasadena City Hall. If y'all want to join, it's 4:00 this afternoon. But the point is, I feel like the officers escalate. That's what I see. I don't see them de-escalating situations. I feel like a lot of times you see cops in crowds in protests getting very angry, getting very hostile, yelling, cussing, pushing people, hitting people, just because it's irritating or for whatever reason, I don't know. And I know that it doesn't have to be that way because we saw how they were at the Capitol when we had the domestic terror attack there. And we also saw even, I would say, during the Nipsey Hussle parade or event here in Los Angeles, where I was out in these streets and I saw how LAPD made the decision to stand down. And people were wiling out a little bit. They were really upset about the death of Nipsey Hussle. And I didn't see that kind of escalation. So that means to me it's a choice. So what can be done about it, and what does this case say about what needs to be done about it?
Several things, Dom. Again, that's another fabulous question. As I said, I've been in this game for 40 years, and there have been lawsuits against the LAPD based on their response to protesters for 30 years. There have been lawsuits with the May Day protesters at MacArthur Park in the early 2000s. There have been journalists such as yourselves with badges and cameras who have been brutalized. It is not simply a matter of training. It is instead a matter of culture. And that is what is most troubling, and that is what our listeners have to understand. There has to be a fundamental shift in the warrior culture that permeates law enforcement officers everywhere. I just heard this morning in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, where that brother Dante Wright was shot in the chest by the woman, Miss Potter, who thought that she was pulling out a taser when in fact she had her handgun. And the city council instituted reforms where there was now a new agency responding without weaponry whenever there'd be a call about drugs or mental illness or something of that nature. And this shift is something that has been experimented in Eugene, Oregon, and in Camden, New Jersey, where different mentalities of policing are beginning to take hold. And as you say, it did get kind of wild off Slauson and Crenshaw when Nipsey was taken away from us. And there was a discernible difference in the response that I agree was caused by a conscious decision of the officers there. But all too often, Dom, it's hard to train for the stress of the moment when you are confronted with that in policing. And regrettably, there's this thing called implicit bias, where people do, because of the brainwashing in media and television, have an opinion of black and brown men that are equal to violence and danger. And women, black women, grab their purses as well or cross the other side of the street. Implicit bias does impact us all. But there has to be understanding and recognition that this attitudinal thing exists. There has to be understanding that this racism is endemic and is structural and has to be rooted out from within. Like the first thing an alcoholic has to do is acknowledge, I am an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic before there can be real change. And until law enforcement acknowledges, yes, We are rooted in racism. We are rooted in racism. Will there ever be the sort of cultural change needed to make the world better for us all?
Well, okay, I guess I'll circle back to this because I want to ask you, Jamal Shakir, of course, for those just joining us, we're talking with attorney Carl Douglas of Douglas Hicks Law in Los Angeles, and Jamal Shakir, a 23-year-old filmmaker who was injured by police after being in a protest, including, he says, his own uncle ordered less lethal projectiles to be fired at him. Jamal, did this change your perception of policing or protests? Did it change the way you view what you... And I know you'll jump in, Attorney Douglas, if I ask anything I'm not supposed to, because I have no clue what I'm not supposed to ask. But did it change your perception of how things work at protests and how they're reported on?
And keep your voice up, Jamal. Keep your voice up.
Definitely. It was one of those situations where, my grandmother's brother is a retired police officer. Once again, Eric, my uncle, he's a police officer currently. So there is never any ill intentions towards police officers before or prior to the situation. And it still isn't. It's just one of those things now where a lot of the things that I believed as far as the systematic oppressions, the injustices that we face systematically on so many different levels was just kind of confirmed. A lot of the things that I do in my work is also based on, the social commentaries of what happens in larger conglomerates and how it affects smaller communities and the people that are in it. So it was just mainly confirming the things that I already felt in reference to the code of honor and the code of ethics from larger authoritative groups compared to the citizens of the U.S. or just communities in general.
Do you think you'd go out and protest again after that experience?
At this point, no.
Really?
I mean, it's one of those situations where I feel like I'm doing everything for a cause. My voice was for a cause. The documentation that I was doing was for a cause. But just being shell-shocked and it still being so fresh, like tomorrow, probably not.
Mm.
And, see that, and sister, dig it, Tom. That's the tragedy of these cases that we often don't see or hear, because this brother is still suffering from the consequences of his injuries. Imagine the isolation he now endures every day because he's afraid of going out. Imagine this was his first time choosing ever to go out and to protest injustices that he saw and what happened when he did. And you can just hear as he speaks how intelligent he is, how articulate he is, and what a positive voice as this young 23-year-old brother is for all of America. Ask him about his backstory. Ask him where his mama is today. Ask him where his daddy is yesterday. He knows. And that will even give you more understanding of this tragedy and why it is so important that the light of Jamal Shakir Jr. be shined for everyone to see.
520-KJLH, 520-5554. If you want to ask those questions, or if you have different questions you'd like to ask of Attorney Carl Douglas or Jamal Shakir, who was hit with less than lethal projectiles by LAPD. He says on the orders of his own uncle, 520-5554, add your area code and let's talk about it. It's the front page. Total Talk Expression, Radio Free, 102.3 KJLH.